So, photography rule number 2 is aperture. Aperture is another way to control the light that enters your camera and therefore affects your final pictures, whether they're brighter or darker. Aperture, the way aperture controls the light entering, different to ISO. The lens of your camera, when you change the aperture, you change the size of the hole inside. So you control how much light gets all the way through to the back in the sensor in here by how big this hole is in the lens. You'll see aperture written down as an F number. So F 2.8, F4, F32 at the other end. The lower the F number, you'll probably see the lowest F number on your camera may well be F4. The lower the F number, the bigger the hole in your lens. So it lets more light in. So F4 will let a lot of light in. F22, somewhere up the other end, will let less light in. If you're using F4, it also narrows your depth of field. So your depth of field is a certain distance from your camera to another certain distance from your camera. Between those two areas is your depth of field. So if you're using a low F number, F4, your depth of field will be very narrow. Depending on how far from your subject, it will get narrower or bigger. If you're closer, it will be narrower. So when you've got a low depth of field, anything that sits between these two areas, these two distances from your camera, will be in focus. I am in focus from my camera, therefore I am within that depth of field. Outside of that depth of field, so closer to the camera and further away from the camera, will be out of focus. You can really use this to your advantage to get some beautiful creative shots. It makes your subject pop. Even if your subject is right over on the side of the picture, it will draw your eye to that if it's in focus. So if you want to let a lot of light into your camera, you need a lower F number. Because you're indoors, you don't have much light available to you, you will need a lower F number. You might want to use that lower F number outside as well because it gives you the narrow depth of field and therefore a blurry background. But if you're outdoors, you will be able to use a higher F number, F22, F32, right up the other end, depending on what your camera is capable of. And that will give you a really big depth of field. So if you're using an F22, your subject, maybe the person standing in front of you, and the mountains behind them will all be in focus. You might want to see what's in the distance, or you might not want to see what's in the distance. Go back to the original sheet with the pink and blue people on it that I talked about earlier. The person in the foreground, pink person in the foreground, blurry mountains in the background with a very low F number. Go up to the other end and you can see, I think it goes to F32. You can see in focus subject in the foreground because you've focused on them. In the background is the also in focus mountains because you've got a high F number, very broad depth of field, everything's in focus. Look somewhere in the middle, you can get everything a little bit out of focus in the background. As long as your focal point is on your subject, whatever that might be, a leaf, an ant, a person, a radiator, whatever it is that you choose to focus on, that will be in focus. And everything out of that distance from your camera, where you've got your depth of field, will be out of focus. So if you look at the example that I've put together for you, you can tell I've got children, can't you? Batman in the garden. You can see the first picture I've used, an F22. the image is darker. Because when you've got a higher f number, a smaller hole, less light gets in, so it's darker. You can see the bushes behind Batman are also in focus. So that means from the distance where the depth of field starts and the distance where the depth of field ends are closer than Batman and further away than the bushes, a broader depth of field to get everything in focus. Second example is f4.5, and you can see that Batman is in focus. He was my focal point in my camera. It's a brighter image because more light got in through the lens because that hole was bigger. Smaller f number, bigger hole, more light gets in. And if you look at the background behind him, the bushes, they are out of focus because they were outside of that depth of field that we achieved by using that low f number, so a narrow depth of field. So the starting distance from the camera, the furthest away distance, the depth of field is in between and Batman is between those two barriers. The hedge behind him is outside, so it's out of focus. You can see that Batman pops in that picture. He is the subject. You can very clearly see that he is what you're supposed to be looking at. Your eye is drawn straight to him. This is how you can use a narrow depth of field, a low f number, to your advantage. It's also very good in most situations because in low light situations you can let a lot more light into your camera. If you're using the semi-automatic mode that I'm going to tell you about a bit later, the other settings will adjust so that it lets still only enough light in to expose the picture correctly, therefore not make it too bright because you've let a lot of light in with that low f number. So go back to the example again. Look at the two differences and you can see darker f22, brighter f4.5. f22's background is in focus, f4.5 background is out of focus. Go and get your camera and try different aperture settings and see what the outcome is. And let me know on the Facebook community if you need any help. Thank you.